So I am not the best speaker or the most polished speaker you're ever going to hear, but I do know a lot about the LGBT community and homelessness. So my name is Gina Reed, and my pronouns are she and her. All right, so that we're on the same page, we're going to go through some definitions so that we have a common language. Anybody tell me what LGBT stands for?
Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender.
Right, okay. Now, a little bit more difficult. Anyone knows what the Q, one of the Q stands for?
Queer.
Questioning and queer. All right, so transgender is someone whose gender identity does not match the gender they were assigned at birth, and cisgender is someone whose gender identity does match the gender they were assigned at birth. Okay? Gender is how an individual defines and expresses their self. And sexuality is based on who an individual is attracted to, so whether that's lesbian, gay, straight, whatever it happens to be. Gender identity is how an individual defines their gender, and gender expression is how an individual expresses their gender to others. All right, so now that we have a common language, we know what everything stands for. I want to do a little background first. So in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association voted to remove homosexuality as a disorder from the DMS. All right, so it was no longer classified as a mental illness, which was wonderful and which was great. But 7 years later, in 1980, because a lot of counselors and psychiatrists and psychologists decided that didn't believe that homosexuality was a normal variant, they came up with ego-dystonic homosexuality, which basically stated that individuals could be diagnosed with this particular disorder if their sexual orientation or attractions were at odds with their idealized self-image, causing anxiety. Now, in the 1980s, I didn't know a single person within this community, LGBT community, that was extremely comfortable in being who they were. So all of them could have been diagnosed with this as a disorder. And the really bad part about this is that this is when we start to see conversion therapy, which it was introduced again at the legislature this year. All right, so 1996, U.S. Department of Defense included homosexuality in a list of mental disorders. And like I said, I'm going to give you a little background. So, 1990s, and what we have are a lot of stereotypes. So, if you were a gay man, basically what you had to see in the media was a flamboyant, over-the-top gays, such as Nathan Lane's Albert in the Birdcage, which it was great. It was an absolutely fabulous movie, but that was one of the stereotypes. Or you could be the sexless gay best friend that was very much acceptable in media as long as they didn't have, they didn't kiss or they didn't show any type of sexual affection whatsoever. And this is actually Justin Walker, and he played Christian in the comedy film Clueless. Then we have the tragic gay. As we slowly emerged from the AIDS crisis of the 1980s, Tom Hanks won an Oscar for 1993's Philadelphia, in which he played an HIV-positive gay man, and basically brought a lot of sympathy to LGBT characters. But it also helped cement the image of the tragic gay in the mind of the mainstream, one that was perpetuated by a century of stories where the queer protagonist dies or ends up alone and miserable in the end. And then once in a while, you had an unusual gay character. The murderous gay. So Matt Damon's Tom Riley, who fancies Jude Law so much that he bludgeons him to death to steal his identity in the talented Mr. Ripley. So, what about if you were lesbian? Well, lesbians be crazy is basically the characters in that decade. So, once a woman has rejected all the conventions of polite society, all bets are off. You have your murderous lesbians, such as Jason Lee in Single White Female. She's the obsessive roommate who will kill your nearest and dearest and copy your haircut. We have characters Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume, which actually was based on a true story, who become instant best friends and proceed to spend every minute possible together. They realize that they are extremely different from most other people and agree to take any steps necessary to ensure that they are not separated, including murder. And then all but for the love of a good man. We have the lesbian waiting only for Ben Affleck and chasing Amy. So, Joy Lauren Adams' Amy is probably a very normal bisexual woman, but in this film, she's portrayed as a lesbian who just hasn't met the right man. So a brief friendship and a short talk with Ben Affleck's Holden, whom is enough to convince her temporarily, thank God, but temporarily to bat for the other side. And then the only bisexual that I really noticed in that decade was Sharon Stone's Catherine Trammell in Basic Instinct. Now, if you were trans, the 90s liked to play off the ultimate fear of your average heterosexual man, that he might be tricked into sleeping with a transgender woman, such as Dill, beautifully portrayed by Jay Davidson in The Crying Game. Trans women were frequently the subject of scorn, seen as shape-shifting deceivers who can't be trusted, or worse yet, serial killers, such as Silence of the Lambs' creepy Buffalo Bill, played by Ted Levine. So, we had these characters, not really much to go on, and in society, we had a few things going on. So one of the big things in that decade was Ellen comes out on her sitcom. So, yay! I can't tell you how many weeks I waited for that episode to come out to see if they were actually going to go through it and to see if they would actually allow it to be shown. Of course, that was followed 9 months later by, yep, you're canceled. So it's during this period that Valley 1 and 10 starts. It was created by Toby Ervader to give LGBT youth a place where they are safe and stereotypes can be dispelled. The reason it was called Valley 1 and 10 was that for most of us, including young people at that time, the only thing that we knew was that from the Kinsey report, which stated 1 in 10 people is LGBT. So we would put a little ad in, it was a little tiny classified ad, and all it would say was, are you a 1 in 10 youth? And then it gave you a phone number to call. So at that time, 99.9% of the youth that came into the group were not out. The only people they were out to were the people that were in that room. So needless to say, because they weren't out, very few of them came out to families in those days. They waited until they had graduated and moved on, or they were away at college, or what have you. Now, once in a while, yes, we did end up with youth that wanted to come out. And inevitably, they always wanted to come out at Thanksgiving, when everybody was going to be together, and where tension and stress was going to be so high, we begged them and begged them, please just do not come out at Thanksgiving. Now, when they did, there wasn't really too many places that we could send them. The one shelter at the time that took youth, meaning 18 to 24-year-olds, What we quickly found out was that if we sent a youth there, we had to tell them over and over and over again, please do not let anyone know that you're LGBT. Because it didn't matter what time the staff found out. If they found out at 2 a.m. in the morning that somebody was gay, lesbian, bisexual, or trans, they were made to exit right then and there. So we marched to show our pride. And that's usually what greeted us. But then things started to change. We started to see marriage equality through different states, and 1 in 10 was now, no matter where we moved, which by the way, 1 in 10 probably changed locations 15 or 20 times in the first 10 years. And so before I left, I hired some of the first people that would come in as employees. So I left. I was done. At the time, I was editor of a lesbian and gay bisexual newspaper. And so I left knowing it was in good hands. And so in June of 26 of 2015, the Supreme Court declares in a 5-4 decision that same-sex marriage should be legal in all 50 states. I returned to 1 in 10, and at the time, at that particular time, I was publisher of a magazine. And so I had watched all across the nation as LGBT folks got more and more rights. And it was phenomenal. And so I returned to 1 in 10, only this time I returned as an employee. And the reason I returned as an employee is that while I was a publisher, I made the mistake of deciding to write a 3-part story on homelessness. And it changed my life. So at the age of 40-something, I ended up switching careers, and I started working at a homeless organization. But like I said, I returned to 1 in 10, and this is who we are today. You got our vision and our mission, so I won't go through that. But some of the ways that we serve youth are through health and wellness programs, education and employment, housing navigation, and recreation and leadership. That's the Downtown Youth Center that I run. It's absolutely huge. We have statewide satellites that have reopened in Anthem and all of these places. We have a TGNC, which is transgender nonconforming group. All of our groups have every possible type of person in them. So all of them are very, very inclusive. But we have 2 specialty groups, TGNC and then Queer of Color, because those youth need a space where they can discuss things without the rest of us. So the staff that go to those and are either identify as transgender or gender nonconforming or queer of color. And then the one thing that was really great from this pandemic was I started getting so many phone calls from parents, and I mean tons and tons of phone calls every single day. And so we started a parents group. We have Camp Outdoors, which is the largest LGBT leadership camp in the world. We take 150 youth up to Prescott every July. And everything to do with 1 in 10 is free. So my first night back, I am in the center, and at the time we had a high school that was attached to the center. And so we had a youth come in, and he kept asking about the school and wanting to know, if he could talk to somebody about joining and what he needed to join. And so I kept telling him, we won't have anybody until Monday. I'm sorry, but you could come in then. And because you're already 18, I am sure there's no problems. You can sign up and get started right away. So at the end of the night, he came up to me and he said, do you have any belts? And I said, yeah. So I picked out a belt. He was pretty small. It was like, I got a 32-inch or 36-inch belt, and I handed it to him, and he said, no, I really need a belt belt that is much, much bigger. And I said, oh, okay. He said, so you're homeless, and you're thinking that by giving you that belt, you can climb up into a tree tonight where you'll be safe. You can wrap the belt around you and the tree trunk, and you're not going to fall out. But you are going to fall out. And so it was at that point that he disclosed that 3 days before, his folks had found out that he was gay. They asked him to leave with nothing but what he had on his person. He had no phone, he had nothing. He went to a friend's house. His main concern was finishing high school and getting his diploma. And the friend said, hey, I heard there's a gay place and they have a high school. So he walked for 3 days to get to 1 in 10 so that he could finish his diploma. And it was at that point when I realized that the years that I had been away from 1 in 10, that we actually were getting more LGBT youth on the street than even in the early days, in the 1990s. So although they represent anywhere from 5 to 8% of the population, LGBT folks are 40% of the homeless. In Maricopa County, on any given night, and this has remained pretty much the same for at least the last 15 years, there's about 1,000 youth on the street, ages 18 to 24. Sometimes it's 100 less, sometimes it's a couple hundred more. Of those in Maricopa County, at any given time, 40 to 44% will identify as LGBTQ+. And just so you know, 15 years ago when I was working with homeless youth, we had approximately 300 emergency beds for that 1,000 youth that were on the street. Today, we have 24. So there are many reasons why LGBT youth end up on the street more often, and well, at a greater ratio than their straight counterparts. 30% report having been physically abused at home. And although a lot of parents aren't kicking out their youth these days, there is still a push out. So a push out is when you make it difficult at home so that you make sure the LGBT person knows that you're not happy with it. You're not happy with the way they are. You're not accepting. But sometimes also what we find occurs at school. And so the youth a lot of times will not say to a parent or to anyone, to an adult, that they're being harassed at school. And so they end up dropping out of school, which then causes problems at home, and then they end up on the street. So the 2019 Glsen National School Climate Survey, which is the last one that came out, demonstrates that Arizona schools were not safe for most lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer secondary school students. In addition, many LGBTQ students in Arizona did not have access to important school research sources such as LGBTQ inclusive curriculum, and were not protected by supportive and inclusive school policies. The vast majority of LGBTQ students in Arizona regularly heard anti-LGBT remarks. Many also heard staff make homophobic remarks, and a lot of them experienced victimization. And only 28% of LGBT students who reported incidents said it resulted in effective staff intervention. Now, one of the other ways that we find a lot of LGBT youth on the street, and actually not just LGBT youth, but all youth, is if they're in the foster care system. So a study in pediatrics, researchers looked at 590,000 plus youth living in California, grades 6 to 12. Less than 1% of the sample lived in foster care or unstable housing, but more than 30% of the youth who did live in foster care identified as LGBTQ. And I want to point out right here, too, that it's not just LGBTQ youth that end up in foster care more often. Youth of color are also vastly overrepresented in the foster care system. And then the Williams Institute conducts independent research on sexual orientation and gender identity law and public policy. And what they found was LGBTQ foster youth in Arizona are more likely to suffer from consistent harassment and abuse in foster care, in juvenile justice settings, and in homeless shelters. At times, they're subjected to dangerous efforts that falsely claim to change their orientation or gender identity, including, like I said, so-called conversion therapy. These incidents are pervasive with trans youth whose identities are rejected in state care and who, when bullied and abused, are often criminalized for acting in their own self-defense. And as of right now, only 13 states protect youth in the child welfare system from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Now, of course, when you end up on the street, the next thing that logically follows is trafficking. So in a research study that came out just a couple of years ago, and you can see Phoenix was included in that being homeless, there was a lot of sex trafficking. Youth ages to 17 to 25 were interviewed. 68% of the youth who had been trafficked or engaged in survival sex or commercial sex had done so while homeless. 91% of respondents were approached by strangers or acquaintances who offered fraudulent job opportunities. 19% of all youth interviewed had engaged in survival sex solely that they could access housing or food. And then LGBTQ youth accounted for 36% of sex trafficking victims. So, what can be done? One of the things is that we need supportive parents, but we also need friends that are supportive of those parents. Because in the parents group, one of the things that I notice is that the parents that come to our group to try and understand what their youth are going through and who have feelings themselves that they don't know how to deal with, rarely have friends that are supportive, that they can turn to. So they're coming to our group. So that's a very big, important thing. We need to also hold legislators accountable. This year, 14 anti-LGBT bills were introduced in the state legislature. 14. And we also need school policies so that children do not drop out. And we also need to train foster parents. We need to train them that here are the things that you should know if you get an LGBT youth. Here are some groups for LGBTQ plus youth. 1 in 10, which is of course my organization. TSAZ is actually for trans youth, but also parents. And AZ Typo is also for trans youth and parents. QChat space is actually just like a chat room, but it's very moderated. And so if a youth doesn't feel comfortable going to a place or they can't access one, QChat is across the nation, and all they have to do is sign up, and it's chat-based. So nobody overhears them or any of those type things that they have to worry about. Okay, some of the health-related organizations are Qtopia, which is very good if it's somebody who identifies as trans to get accurate health information. And then Phoenix Children's Hospital is really great. We refer a lot of youth to Phoenix Children's Hospital. And you can actually go up to age 24 with them. And here's a good one to take a picture of. All right, so that's the end of my slide presentation, and that's mostly so that I don't go off on a tangent, which is what I tend to do. So, if you need to get a hold of me or you want to ask questions, you can email me there. So, do we have questions? The question was, do organizations, homeless organizations like Tumbleweed, who say they accept LGBT youth but maybe don't, does that help or hurt? It hurts, but also Tumbleweed no longer exists. Yeah, Tumbleweed disbanded, it went bankrupt about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even more. So UMOM acquired some of the programs that they ran, but Tumbleweed had at one point 2 youth centers so that any type of homeless youth could come in. They could get case managers to try and help them get housing, to help them get an education if that's what they needed, to clean up, get food, clothing, what have you. It also had 2 outreach teams that went out at night to find homeless youth and to try and tell them about the resources so that they would come in and so that they would have access to those resources. And then they had about 200 or so units. So as of today, the only resource center that I am aware of that a youth can come in is actually ours. So we serve a lot of straight LGBT youth. And the problem is, not just with homeless shelters, but like with foster care or whatever, we actually train a lot of staff with different organizations and doctors and nurses and people in the education field. But unfortunately, in a lot of these systems, the turnover is so great that they might have a very, very inclusive staff, but then that staff changes and those new people haven't been trained. So yes, it does hurt. I had 2 trans-identified youth that came into the center. One had been beaten up pretty badly, and they were on the street. And unfortunately, like I said, there's only 24 emergency beds for that age group. Do any of you know Central Arizona Shelter Services? That's where a lot of, has a campus, and that's basically where a lot of homeless people go to. A lot of youth will not go there because you have a lot of chronically homeless individuals who've been on the street for a long, long time that have mental health issues. And so there tends to be a lot of violence, and so a lot of youth will not go down there. And so there's really no places that I can send them. And I think that's the hardest thing, is knowing that there is no place. And I don't care if the youth is gay or in the queer community or if they're straight. There's no place to send them. And that's just the way that it is today. But yes, there still is discrimination. I'm not sure if Arizona passed this or not, but if they did, it's only been recent. But you could still, in a lot of places in this state, if you find out that somebody is LGBT, you can deny them housing. It still exists. Because we're a right-to-work state, you can fire anybody for any reason. So we do get a lot of people that call us asking for legal resources, which we really do not have. You know, that they were fired when, you know, someone found out that they were whatever, fill in the blank. It wasn't insulting things against God. It was actually Reverend Phelps, and he and his family have a church and a website that is called God Hates Fags. And so they will picket, and they have a lot of different times whenever there's an LGBT parade. They also started doing it with soldiers that were dying in Iraq and were being sent home. They would have these same signs saying that that your son or your daughter died because our country loves fags. What what was going on that had parents calling more during the pandemic and asking about help for their youth or for themselves. And one of the things that we've noticed is that as the media changed and we have more people that can identify as LGBT because they can see somebody that looks like them, right? So when 1 in 10 started, I used to, because I was an editor of a newspaper, I wore a dress and heels. So when the boys came through that door for the first time, number one, any kid that walked through that door said, I know God hates me, okay? That's the way it was in those days. The second thing, if it was a guy, is that because of the way I looked, they would think, okay, maybe I could talk to her about this. So they'd come over and they would, kind of say, I'm really worried because I don't like doing hair and I don't have any artistic abilities. Because that's what they thought, that there were just certain things that were opened up to them. But as media portrayed more and more different types of people and people started to realize, oh, Cousin Sue is LGBT or what have you. Kids started to have the language now. They started to be able to identify themselves earlier, and so they start coming out at an earlier and early age. And what happened during the pandemic is you had these youth that were stuck at home, right? They're not being allowed to go out or whatever. They have an awful lot of time to think about things. And so it was a lot of self-discovery on their part. And it was interesting because the majority of the calls that I was getting were parents of youth that were between the ages of 6 and 12. And so it was because of that. We don't take youth that young, but we do have a partnership with Big Brothers Big Sisters. It's one of only 2 LGBT site-based Big Brothers Big Sisters in the country. So what they do is Eva, who's in charge of the program, basically matches a big and a little that identify the same way. And then they meet at our center a couple times a month. They do different activities as a group and go on outings and all kinds of things. So we will take youth in that program that are like 6 years of age, but for the most part, they have to be 13 or over. It's interesting because I love working with youth, and that means anyone from about 14 to 24. I love working with them, right? And I can say, hey, ABC, and they go, hey, ABC. And then I started working with parents, and I had a whole new appreciation for teachers because I go ABC, and they go XYZ, and I go, no, ABC, and they go, no, XYZ. So we started getting tons and tons of parents, so that's why we opened up the parents group, which that was only opened about 6 months ago, and we have 175 parents. So on the one hand, I'm thrilled to death because it means that they care enough about their kiddo that they're in that group. You mean a policy that I could say would be helpful? One that would be really, really helpful, we had a policy here that, gosh, what did we call that? It was the no gay policy. And so basically what the policy had originally said was you couldn't talk about LGBT people who were HIV positive in a positive light. That got twisted around by politicians. And so for a couple of decades, teachers were afraid to talk about anything to do with LGBT people. I would have teachers call and say, I had a kid come out to me, but I'm afraid to tell them any information. So they finally did away with that policy just a couple of years ago, but unfortunately the policies, a lot of the policies that were introduced this year would basically take us back there. One of the policies that is making its way through, and it will probably get passed, is that before you could say lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender in your classroom, you have to get permission from the students' parents. So in a lot of ways, that will end up being probably more restrictive than the other policy was. So that's why you have to be aware of bills and you have to hold people accountable. Because the vast majority of Arizonans don't believe in those type of policies. But the people that get heard are the ones that are the loudest. The question was, did we see an influx in people because of being alone and not being able to be around other folks? We closed on March 13th, which was a Friday, right? They came in and told us we're closing tonight. I was the last person out the door, never knowing that it was going to last this long, right? But on that Monday, we had already gotten, we started digital programs. So we started Zoom programs and all these things that we all had to learn on the fly. So what we saw were youth coming in to those programs because, you know, they didn't have any other outlets. But unfortunately, those youth that had to share computers, who maybe didn't have Wi-Fi at their homes, they couldn't access us. And so we did see, I mean, we would do these surveys every once in a while, and they were anonymous, and the anxiety levels became really super high. And I think that's happened across the board with youth, is that while they were cooped up like that, anxiety just became really, really a problem. And so even now, we have a lot of youth that, even though we've reopened, the anxiety is such that they're afraid to come in. So we're still seeing some of that. There is one thing, though, that I want to say to you, and this is just homelessness in general. We will not solve homelessness if we continue to do what we do. And that is about 10 years ago, they introduced a thing called the SPDAT. So the SPDAT is given to anyone that becomes homeless and to get a voucher or to get into some type of housing. And so you get rated according to how many times you've been assaulted, how many emergency room visits you've made, how long you've been on the street. So that gets you up there so that you don't have to wait quite as long for that voucher. The problem is that while you're waiting for that voucher, you have all of these other people that are hitting the street, and we are waiting until they have been so traumatized on the street that it is going to take much, much longer for them to be able to turn their lives around. Because the first week you are, within the first few days of being homeless, you will lose all of your belongings, including your ID. You tend to lose your belongings every 4 to 5 days. Within the first week, you will be given an opportunity to have drugs for free. And practically every day after, you're going to be offered drugs for free. And I think that was one of the things my parents asked. Well, how many of these kids are drug addicts when I was working just primarily with homeless youth? And the answer is 95% are not drug addicts. That's not how they ended up the street. They only start using drugs after being on the street. Whether that's to try and stay awake so that no one assaults them, or they start using drugs because they just want to forget. So until we have enough shelter space and money put into it and case managers that when a family or an individual ends up on that street, that we put them someplace safe where they don't have to worry about any of those things, and we start working with them to get them back, you know, off the street and into some type of housing, we will never solve housing problems here. It will continue to be this vicious cycle. Okay? All right, so good luck in all of your studies, and I wish you luck in your midterms, or you probably had midterms, right? So your finals when you get to those.